Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon on our session on catalyzing inclusive growth through anticipatory science. As you know, the world is experiencing breakthroughs in science and technology at an unprecedented pace, while humanity is facing global challenges now more than ever that are putting people and the planet under stress and in great uncertainty. So anticipation in this regard is a key tool to build a future with the aim of early and fully exploiting this scientific potential for the well-being and inclusive development for all. So anticipating where the next such technological or scientific opportunities will come could help map out a path towards economic emergence that is both equitable and inclusive. Or can it? That's what we'll be exploring this afternoon. Before we get into our session, just a quick reminder about the Breakthrough Radar, the tool that has been unveiled during the summit. If you haven't already, please do get the QR codes to access it digitally. Else, for the old school folks, there are books of the radar. I don't know if you get the same interactive experience, you should let us know. I believe we have a poll question before we start. Are we set for that? Okay, great. So if you have your mobile phone, I don't know for the folks who are analog or what would be the equivalent, but or you can open any web browser and go to Slido. I think it's sli.do, where you'll be asked to be a participant and use the code hashtag GESDA21. So let me stop there. Browsers open. Check. Slido, I think, is sli.do. Check. Use hashtag GESDA21, and you should be able to see the question. The thumbs up will be great. Okay, wonderful. So our question is, how optimistic are you that scientific or technological innovation will help accelerate inclusive development? So are you very optimistic? Are you moderately optimistic or not optimistic at all? And you can also shout it out, actually. Not at all. Okay, moderately. Very. We have some realists in the room. Great.
Realists, optimists.
Optimists. Yeah, I guess
yeah.
post-2020 optimism is in limited supply. Okay. We have a starting poll there. So moderately is where we are. All right, all right. Okay, they're moving. Very and not at all are competing there. My country would be worried about if that was an election outcome, what's happening. Anyhow, my name is Nigeria Sambuli. I will be the moderator for this discussion. And I'm joined by an esteemed panel here of great, great doers. To my extreme right is Rebecca Enonchong, who's the founder and CEO of AppsTech in Cameroon. Next to her is Uzo Iweala, who's the CEO of the Africa Center in Harlem. Mami Mizutori is a special rep for the Secretary General, UN Secretary General, for disaster risk reduction, and head of the UN Office for disaster risk reduction. And last but not least, we have Momar Diang, who's the Chief Strategy and Partnerships Officer at AIM's Next Einstein Initiative in Rwanda. So without further, let me just go to Mami first. In your experience, how has this concept of anticipatory breakthrough science been incorporated in global risk and opportunity preparedness?
Thank you very much, and great to be in this panel with the future generation, as we say. Disaster risk reduction is my business, and if we're talking about development, whether it's inclusive or not, it has to be inclusive. If we cannot reduce disaster risk, we cannot have development, and even if we have development, the gains will be lost. So it's very important that we prevent better and we make sure that hazards, whether they're natural or man-made, do not become disasters. And science, anticipatory science, is very important for this, because if you want to do this, prevent better, you have to understand what is the nature of the disaster that surrounds you. We say it's systemic. What does it mean? It means a lot of data, a lot of information has to come together so that we understand what is the impact of disaster. If we don't understand that, we won't go to the second priority, which is having good governance around risk. And then thirdly, important thing is to invest into resilience, but we won't be investing into resilience if we're not sure about the impact of the investment. So in this aspect, science is very important to allow us to understand what is the nature of risk. We at my organization, we have a project with countries like Somalia, Bangladesh, Fiji, all very at risk from disasters, to help them gather, help them first understand what is the gap in their data, to understand the risks that they're surrounding them, whether it's climate, whether it's other, or whether it's COVID, right? And for this, we're using science. But in terms of investing in resilience, we are also trying to use science. And here I use the word trying because to provide evidence that investment in resilience prevention pays. But here we're not doing a good job yet because it's not very easy to give accurate metrics about resilience. That's why we invest a lot in climate mitigation, but not much in climate adaptation or resilience. So I think here we need more science. And although we are using science for this, we need more science here.
Interesting. So science, usually when invoked, sounds very objective, will align people towards that. But in your experience, what are some of the successes or barriers to actually using, say, in tools like anticipatory science versus what's proven impossible or what people are more familiar with towards actually making this happen?
So, of course, science is a bit of a, let's say, high-level word. What we really need to provide more to people, and we're successful if we can provide more open source data, information for policymakers. When we are successful in providing more capacity building enhancement so that the literacy around data and information is there on the ground, and they can actually use it for making decision, whether it's in the sector of agriculture or the sector of infrastructure or the sector of gender equality, whatever, then we are more successful. But the difficulty that we are having is that it comes to international cooperation, not only in terms of money, but in terms of technological transfer, in terms of capacity development, it's not enough. So the countries which need most this part of the science are not still getting it.
Interesting. We'll revisit that. Mar, capacity has been brought up. And we often hear calls for capacity development. In Africa, where a bunch of us in this panel are from, there's even goals like, having African Union member states invest up to 1% of GDP to science or R&D. Or in your view is hindering progress towards sustained capacity development in Africa or the global South more broadly?
Thank you. I want to just maybe take a step back. When I think of capacity, the first thing that comes to mind is agency and the ability to imagine a new future, something different. Right? You have to ask yourself, what are we building capacity for? It's to change our current lives or to influence the future. And I think that one of the things that we are lacking sometimes, not always, but is this ability to have agency and to think about a different future. And I'm going to give you a simple example. It's no secret that Africa is one of the parts of the world that's moving towards urbanization in the current century and over the next few decades. Most of the population in Africa will become urban. And few African cities are really thinking about that in an anticipatory way and are using their imagination, local officials up to the central government level to really imagine new cities, new African cities, and make sure that we are ready for that urbanization. So to me, it starts with that ability to have agency and to believe that you can influence your future before you can actually invest in it. The second part maybe is this ability to maybe go down to the subnational and maybe non-public, non-governmental level. So when we think about capacity building, as you just said, we think about percent of GDP, we think about all of these national level goals. But again, to me, we have to be able to go 1, 2, 3 levels below and think about crowdsourcing capacity. This morning, I was in an email exchange arguing with my co-tenants in my apartment building, again, to hark upon the urbanization part. And you see that in a lot of communities, urban communities in Africa, we again don't have maybe capacity at the local government level to help organize, mediate what that development is going to look like over the next few years. So we have to, organizations such as the UN and other international organizations have to maybe think beyond governments when they think about capacity building and be able to think about communities. I could use the example of organizing cultural life, artists, right, to so that they can organize themselves and be able to make maybe our cultural industries more vibrant. I could think about farmers and agricultural communities, which are very maybe non-industrialized at this point, or don't use a lot of technology, but need to be their capacity needs to be built in order for them to get to the next level. So again, I'm very reluctant to only think about capacity in terms of governments and GDP. I want to think about it more at the lower level. And then maybe third, I would want it to be a more multidisciplinary endeavor, right? A lot of capacity building programs are very focused. It's building capacity to do X, Y, Z in a specific field. And again, I think one of the lessons that we're learning in this forum and in general is that most of the problems we'll have to solve will be very multidisciplinary in nature, and you'll have to bring a lot of different skills and attitudes and know-hows and knowledges in order to be able to solve them. So one of the things that's hindering this investment, or at least the success of this investment, is that we still think about it in terms of very narrow fields and being able to do very narrow things as opposed to a more, I would say, general problem-solving attitude.
So let me throw a wildfire question out there. Have you come across initiatives that are trying to build capacity in that regard, in a multidisciplinary sense? So take IM's next initiative, for example. There's a whole finding the next Einstein. Is it being found because he's a mathematical genius who's already been in a formal university, or how are you incorporating this idea that we're probably going to be finding them in less formal structures?
I agree that it doesn't have to come from a higher education setting, but that's one of the things that AIMS is trying to do, absolutely, is to create the next generation of African scientists. And I'm very excited about that, about the work that we do in terms of making sure that we have the kind of resources on the continent that would help us be part of the fourth industrial revolution and not just use results of what's being developed in the West, but also be contributors to it. But you're absolutely right. Outside of the science and the academic world, we also have to be able, as I said earlier, to build capacity in community settings, outside of the sort of formal training settings. And I do believe that that is going to be more sustainable, because again, when you think about capacity building, at least when I think about it, I think about something that should be endogenous. And for it to be sustainable, it needs to be endogenous. And for it to be endogenous, it needs to go beyond some of these well worn out sort of settings, such as governments, such as maybe universities, and be able to go into the community.
Thanks for that. Uzo, let me bring you in, because Momar has already hinted at culture. But usually when we talk about science and technology, culture, civil society are always an afterthought, if at all they come up in the conversation. But how can these fundamental social aspects, in your view, be brought into the conversation or into the mechanisms right from the get-go? What are we getting wrong? What should we be doing right, if it's possible?
Right. That's a good question. I'm not sure that I have an answer, but I'll say something, and hopefully it will make sense. So, I mean, first, I think just to go back to something, you kind of sort of made the joke about science as this sort of out there entity. And, when I think about sort of science and culture and sort of the idea that there's a split between the two, I think it goes right back to the understanding of what science is and how we're conditioned to think about science. And I think a lot of people who are sort of in the field of science, or, science, and I say that, I'm sure you guys have all read those articles that are like, science says, and like as if science is some kind of deity or God, right? But not even studies. Like, we've gone beyond the studies part to the just like, science says that if you eat breakfast on Tuesday, you're going to be a genius or something like that. Like, those kinds of things. And I think what that really actually goes back to is this relationship between science and culture, and where science actually fits within the way that we conceive the world. And so, I just background wise, I happen to be, I guess, I have a medical degree, and I also am a novelist and a filmmaker as well. And so I think, what you see if you can bring these two things together is the way that so much of how we think about what science is and what it does is actually culturally constructed, right? It's constructed by the narratives we have about ourselves, and what science ends up doing, like science in this way, is it like actually conforms to a lot of the dreams and the stories that we put together in our quote unquote cultural life. So you're not going to explore things that your culture doesn't think of as important. That's the first thing I think we need to think about. The second thing is that, I think in Western societies, again, science has occupied the place in many ways or competes directly with this idea of a deity. But I think a lot of times scientists don't realize how incredibly structured, like a religious institution, like the sort of like the presentation of scientific inquiry is. That's one. And then two, layered on top of that is, when you live in a culture that assumes that its values are universal, right? Then you also get into a situation where you're not interrogating in a way that makes like actual sense for the thing that you consider to be paramount, right? So consider things like this. When you look at, and there's so many examples. I think one of the best ones is when you think about medical discoveries, right? Or like drugs that people use. A lot of those drugs are like the way that we even test to see what's useful is very culturally conditioned. So most of those drugs, if they're modeled, right? Some of them are modeled on mice models, right? But a lot of those are done on male mice, right? As opposed to female mice. So you get drugs that and dosages and all that sort of stuff that work for a certain segment of the population because your population is culturally conditioned to believe that as the universal understanding of what human is, right? And it plays out in really interesting ways, right? So you develop things like birth control products for women, right, or pills for women with massive amounts of side effects. You do it for men, all of a sudden, like, it's a no-go area because it doesn't work because, like, again, society is conditioned to do certain things for certain people who are considered like people, right? And I think these are all the things that come in when you start thinking about the relationship of culture and science and how those two things speak to each other, or even the idea that they speak to each other is sort of getting away from the fact that the point that from the beginning, your science or your inquiry is operating within a particular cultural context that is really important for us to be aware of if you're actually going to use the thing in a way that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's my,
As I was saying earlier, even these mics are clearly
Right.
designed with the man in mind. And I'm afraid to report that the pandemic has not made us rethink
Not
some of
change
these
that.
basics
And the color.
and the
It's
the
supposed
color,
to be
right?
discreet, like you
Exactly.
can't
So
see
all
it,
these
right?
pictures that are being taken will look quite odd on some of us.
Right. But so I
It looks
just-
like
I
we have
just-
new appendages.
I think it just goes back to this idea of like, what questions you ask in sort of a scientific framework are just conditioned by the way culturally that you are trained to see the world. And, for parts of the world that we're from, right? Parts that people generally think exist outside of science, right? Which have been said by various people and various outside of science, outside of history, outside of all these things. Like it's a real, the conditioning is a real thing, right? And then it leads to, I think, to some of what you're talking about in terms of capacity building. It leads to, if you have educational systems that were set up primarily for administration as opposed to inquiry, like you're not going to get the same development of a sort of like a try and fail process within the formal education system. And then if you have this belief that, say, Africans exist outside of science, you're not going to look for areas where actual innovation is happening. And if you think that also like science happens like within the temple of the university, right, then you'll forget that even within Western society, so much of what we think of as massive innovation occurred by trial and error in so many different environments. Somebody like says, okay, I have a steam engine. How can I make it go that much faster? Let me tweak this and see what happens. And then that happens. And then another person says, let me do that. And like it happens. And you take that in and there's this narrative that's developed that all happened in this wonderfully constructed, like pristine ivory tower situation. You go out to a place like Lagos in Nigeria, like where you have folks, all these young kids who are tinkering with cars and developing, ways of adding efficiency to engines and all that sort of stuff. There are all these people who are practicing the trial and error that is science without that formal framework for what science is. They exist outside of science, and yet I think they are some of the folks that will be most innovative in the world to come when we all face a situation where the amount of money, the amount of resources we have to put to these things for everyone in the world,
Mm.
not going to be the same as it is now.
Before we go down that interesting rabbit hole, let me bring in Rebecca. Then the other angle we hear obviously is private sector. The role of the private sector is harped on about how there's important players. But again, on our perspective, it goes beyond just multinationals or established private sector players. We've seen the rise of innovation on the fringes, if you'll call it that, the tech hubs and labs that have proliferated. How can these folks and these setups, these alternative private sector formations be supported to actually contribute to this so-called anticipatory science we're talking about, breakthroughs that we're looking for in our corner of the world?
That's such a great question. And I can't, like, how am I going to say anything after what you just said?
There's always something.
But because what he just pointed out is just incredibly true. And and I think I'll give an example through the innovation hubs. One of my hats is that I'm board chair of an organization called Afrolabs. And Afrolabs is a network of innovation centers across the African continent. We have about 300 members in 50 different African countries, 52 soon. And these are all independent centers. Most of them, a few of them are associated with universities, but mostly it's just people like me that are entrepreneurs and that want to support other African tech entrepreneurs and give them an environment within which to function, their garage or their basement. And I say this because culturally, when you're in the US, you don't really need these, right? When you think of an accelerator incubator, you're thinking of a Y Combinator, 500 startups that's going to take your startup and help it scale because you have internet at home, right? And you're working in your family's basement and you don't need to, worry about rent. And, so we're actually having to provide that environment, that garage or that basement, and let entrepreneurs tinker and let them be able to, test and fail and test and fail. And we actually have in our hubs in Cameroon, we have a group of hubs, and we have a monthly event called Zero Macabu. And it really just means that it's a failure. It's where we have somebody come and talk about their failures because we need to introduce into our culture the ability to fail. And it's okay to fail. And actually failure, if you can take failure as a lesson, it will help you evolve. But being private sector and being not multinationals, this startup community, and Afrolabs supports about 1 million African entrepreneurs across the continent that are, within our network. And what we've found is that whether it's governments or international organizations, they see this startup community as like a pet thing. Oh, they're so cute, And so they call us, literally call. And like, oh, we need 10 startups, for an event next week. Can you send them,
Startups on demand.
Yeah. And then you go and then, there's a picture and then they see and like, oh, we're cool. We support startups. They'll give them their transport money. And I mean, it's just so disrespectful towards what's an industry, right? And our governments, particularly African governments, have not yet seen that these startups are actually part of the innovation industry, and that this industry, just like oil, or other industries, have the ability to contribute enormously to the GDP, right? And enormously to our evolution on the world stage. And it's just very frustrating to see how they really just, it's like a different category. It's like, oh, the cute little children that are really, and I feel so blessed and so excited. I think I lost my mic thingy. So can you still hear me? Okay. So I feel so blessed that I have an opportunity to see this innovation firsthand. I'm one of the judges in the Royal Academy for African, they call it the Africa Prize for Engineering. And so we see all this type of innovation and people that are creating, young people that are just, and you're looking at the circumstances within which they're creating and developing and innovating. And you're just like, you did this with that, you know? And when you see have judges and others that come from other countries, like Silicon Valley, like another country, they are like, they don't understand. They're like, did you miss zeros when you were talking about how much it costs you to get this done? You know, and so there's so much capacity for innovation. And you know, Omar, you talked about capacity building. So what we've done at Afrolabs, we've taken that development term and so we've used it and we've created a 3-year capacity building program for our hubs to better support our startups. You know, so a lot of it is, you know, how to run your hub better and how to make your startup more investment ready, but also some of it is how to navigate the political waters and, you know, how to deal with government, how to lobby for a startup act, you know, those types of things that are also relevant. And, you know, we have to find a way to better sell ourselves to the development community and to our governments. And we're not necessarily well skilled at that.
It makes me wonder, having been involved in the hubs world for many years before, you know, you talked about the fail fairs, or if you call them that, and why they exist. And could we wager that part of it is because the models or approaches folks have tried to use to build the solutions are modeled on this notion of what's right, the standard established, typically Western way of let's get a hoodie. So if you look like an entrepreneur, dress the part, use the model, use the language, but it's not fit for the purpose in the context we're working on. And what are some of the ways you can start deconditioning, not just the entrepreneurs, but folks like these who work in bigger echelons of systems that should be challenged in how they're channeling their support?
Can we talk about COVID? I don't know if it's politically incorrect because.
Talk about it.
Yeah, let's talk
Preach.
about COVID because I think that's a really great example of what you're talking about. So at the beginning of COVID, and actually even still now, there's so much money available for African entrepreneurs to create COVID apps. We don't need them, but hey, we'll take the money and it'll help build the skills. But this idea that that was developed in the Western world that, oh my God, COVID is a huge pandemic, and it is. I'm not understating COVID. I'm just saying the impact on the African continent has not been the same as here, right? And so for me, a lot of it is like saying to Italy, you need to build a malaria app because because there is a malaria pandemic, it's not the same. So the impact, so our ability to use those applications is just completely different, but there's money and you're throwing money but it happens so often. And we see this with COVID, but we also see it in so many areas where somebody sits and decides, well, this is, they're putting their frame of mind and their culture and trying to, they don't even consider the fact that it might be different in Africa. And we see this with the funding. It's very difficult to raise funds as an African founder,
Right.
Even in Africa. Right.
The money is here.
And I'm saying that this because we talk about this. We talk about this on Twitter. So where most of the funding goes to foreign founders in Africa. So we're replicating the Silicon Valley model, which is very little money going to diverse founders. And we're applying it to Africa, where we're saying that this is what a successful founder looks like. He looks like Mark Zuckerberg, right? And so we are giving them the same amount of money, even though there are local founders that are not benefiting from that funding. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, billions. We're at $3 billion this year in 2021 of money raised by startups, which is a record, and it's great, and we're happy. But most of that money has gone to non-African founders that are competing with local founders with huge amounts of money. So it's a double whammy.
Somebody
Right.
had to say it.
It's harming us as local founders. But I was like, okay, it's money, now it like, at least we're recognizing that Africa, technology in
Rising.
Africa, blah, 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 is a good thing. And so we're hoping, and this is being optimistic.
We'll go back to that poll, by the way,
We're
after this.
hoping that this will mean that that local founders will eventually, like Africa as a continent is getting more visibility amongst larger, more established investors, investment, and that, maybe that whole thing about Africa is like this, jungle thing. It's actually now a place where people can see that they can make money. Because a lot of the early investments into African startups and African innovation has been foundations, right? Has been impact investment, has been really like charity. But now these are investors that are like the WeWork investor, right? I mean, these are investors that they want to make money, that are now putting in, hundreds of millions of dollars into Africa-based startups. I don't want to say African startups because it's not the case, but that's very, very validating. And I think it's a milestone, but it's definitely a challenge and something that we need to address. But yeah.
But you're right, because I remember the deputy director of the Africa CDC talking about, for all that talk and focus on COVID, in Africa, we have 18 parallel epidemics.
Yeah.
Right? So how we run to fixate, and then we didn't get the vaccines. So yeah, yay, breakthrough. Yeah,
Well, I
so-
wanted to say something a little bit, just because you brought up this issue of funding, and I think that people often get a bit touchy, right, when funding is raised, because people will say things like, oh, well, it's our money, right? Like, so we're going to fund what we're interested in, and we're going to fund the people that we most have faith in, right? And I think it just goes back against like to contextualizing like how that works, right? For one, the question about who looks like an innovator, who looks like a founder is really, really important. Two, the question is, there's a completely like uneven distribution of resources. There's a historical context for why. Everybody hates bringing up like the reason for why resources are unevenly distributed. Everybody hates bringing up the reason for why, like the money is with Silicon Valley folks and the money is with like, American or British or Swiss foundations. I remember I gave a talk here talking about philanthropy as reparations, or philanthropy as like kind of a pseudo thing, when the actuality is, let's call it what it is. It wasn't received very well, but that's a whole other thing. But the truth is, like, you have to think about, and fine, we can agree that like who has the people who have the money do in a sense dictate where that money goes. But let's not fool ourselves into then suggesting that a certain population is not capable if the resource gap to start with is already so wide, and the allocation of resources follows again what is culturally defined as success within that space. That's one. And then the second point is also, when you think about this idea of failure, this is directly tied to resources, because it's true, like some people are allowed to fail and will get more money if they fail. And just try being like an African entrepreneur, an African scientist or whatever, and not having your stuff work out. And so this again goes back to this idea of having like an administrative state, where you can't fail. Like that's the whole, like administrators, bureaucrats are so, tense because they don't want to screw things up, versus like an inquisitive state where it's all about iteration. And, again, if you set up structures for administrative states versus inquisitive states, like you're going to 100% of the time, the inquisitive state where people are allowed to fail will move faster, further than the one in which that's not the case. And then you have to look at within those spaces, who's allowed. And for the most part, I mean, and this is not just with sort of scientific inquiry, it's with, movement of resources, it's with, funding. Like if a development project doesn't work in an African country, oh my God, these people are so corrupt, they don't know what they're doing, they're incompetent. And yet we see this example of people throwing tons of money at, like projects run by people who don't look like us that go nowhere, and they get more money.
Right.
And that again is like a cultural conditioning here. And that's just, I think we just need to be aware of it when we talk about why certain places move faster than others in terms of this process of inquiry.
Yeah, so
If
true.
I
Yes,
may,
Mami.
development funding, I'm thinking about the UN rule, right?
I was
Development
gonna
funding,
ask you about that. Yeah.
because okay, we try our best wherever we are in Africa or Latin America to empower the people on the ground so that they carry on their own development, right? But sometimes, and this is like, there is no off the record here, but I am thinking, if the UN is always there, our country teams with our agencies, and if we get the money from the donors, and if we try to implement it, is this model really the best model, right? Because the thing is, and now some donors are changing the way they do business, like the European Union. They want to give money more directly to, let's say, if it's an African Union Commission, and say, okay, you run this, and then the UN is like, wait, how about us? Because but but I really think that that's a future that we really should aspire for. And I think everybody do, but the model of our development work is really not like that at this moment. And talking about, resource, how things are funded, I think we need to change the way that it's funded, because unless it may not work. And just one more thing. So risk is a combination of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, right? And the exposure and vulnerability in each country, in each region, in each community is different. So if you do not know what is the vulnerability and exposure, and I think this is close to what you said about COVID, in a country in Africa or in a region in Africa, then you're not really going to be able to reduce that risk. So I'm just starting to even think about the capacity building that we do around risk in all the different countries and regions. Are we doing the right one, or do we have too much of a kind of a straitjacket model? And are we trying to say, okay, this is what you should do, but maybe we don't.
I was going to say, I mean, what if already evidence, and I want to be Robin Momar as well here, is there, whether it's anecdotal or it's qualitative, whether it's empirical, however evidence is qualified, is showing that the models that are being used are not right. What happens then? You mentioned moving from, say, the EU going to the AU, and we're like, they didn't ask us if that's the way to go about it. And it talks about something Mama mentioned about going with the agency, right? Going beyond the capacity building to governments. I wanted to bring back Mama to react on that, because I'm thinking here, for a while there, I think the signal has been that these models are not working. But if the established systems, the bureaucracies are not going to listen to the fact that it's not working, what do we do here? And maybe in this case, starting with Momar and then opening to the rest of you before we open to the audience, is what would be your advice to GESDA that's trying to find another way, having heard all this? And I'd even frame it this way: what should they not do? Because sometimes we talk about what we should do, and then we have the lofty goals. Maybe it's what should they not do in light of what we're talking about. But Momar, let me come back to you.
So I don't want to be on the record as saying anything negative about the AU. I have a lot of friends there, and
I can
but
do that
the
for you.
reality.
Yeah, we'll
of,
cover it.
Yeah.
We'll
Yes.
cover it.
Yeah.
but the reality of it is that I really don't think that going one level up, actually, as I see it, it would be helpful. Actually, as I was saying earlier, I think we should go 3 levels down, right? So instead of the AU, which is even it's in some cases further removed from what's happening on the ground than the governments themselves, and the governments are already quite removed for some of them.
Most.
I think that it would be, if I had a piece of advice for GESDA, it would be to figure out a way for this diplomacy part of the endeavor, not to mean governmental diplomacy, but it should be a diplomacy that's open to civil society, to larger groups, right? And not only science, as my colleague said, in the academic, higher education, university sense of it, but much broader. I mean, we are talking about health, and the fact that the African continent, yes, has a lot of pandemics, but it's also a huge untapped resource in terms of possible remedies and possible drugs and possible bio health answers to many of these things that haven't been really exploited yet because there hasn't been the kind of big pharma money behind it. A lot of the infrastructure that would be needed to test some of these remedies that are centuries old in some of our cultures is just not there. There is no investment in sort of industrializing sort of that informal health infrastructure that we have in our culture. So that's one aspect to think beyond governments again. The second, which to me is a very hopeful note, is just the fact that the youth bulge on the continent is going to be our biggest, I think, hope over the next 20, 30, 40 years. Everyone talks about the demographic transition, and I think that's where AIMS's mission really is to make sure that among those young people who will make up the majority of the youth on the globe over the next 20, 30 years, that we make sure that we have very well-educated people who are able to be actors of the fourth industrial revolution, who are steeped in blockchain, in artificial intelligence, in data science, and so that we can maybe use the forces of capitalism in a productive way, in the sense that I see a lot of big Silicon Valley companies now thinking of Africa as the next place where they should have their delivery centers. They're not doing it in a philanthropic way. It's not because they like us, it's because they realize that it's much cheaper to employ engineers now, or it will be soon, in Africa than it is in India and definitely in the US. So it's in their interest to make sure that they invest in institutions like AIMS, so that the next data science engineers come out of institutions like AIMS, and that would be much better for their bottom line than trying to, continue investing in training in India and other places. So to me, that's a huge part of the hope factor. And I hope that if GESDA can serve in terms of maybe sensitizing our governments and partners outside of Africa, it is to think of development and anticipatory science beyond governments and beyond big institutions.
So?
Yeah, I just like to what you said, to add to that, just or maybe take issue with one point, which is this idea of like I think you said something a little bit about scientific innovation and our sort of our knowledge not being used or industrialized or monetized. And I actually just want to go back and say that I would take issue with it because, and I think it's just embedded in the stories that we tell about science. So I'll just give a couple of examples. So we all got vaccinated. I hope everyone got vaccinated.
That would have been
and
here
if
otherwise.
you haven't, don't talk to me. But if you think about the smallpox epidemic back in Massachusetts in this is like the 1700s, the person who brought the idea of inoculation to the United States that helped deal with this epidemic was actually an enslaved African person working with Cotton Mather, right, who birthed the whole line of Harvard presidents. That's one. Two, if you think about a lot of the developments in gynecology, right, a lot of that, you have to decide on, like, again, think about cultural frameworks. Like the scientists within our minds, within this Western construct, is basically that narrative is a hero's journey narrative, right? It's lone individual against all challenges, rises to the top, discovers something, and then everybody, comes back and suddenly the world is better. You don't hear about the fact that J. Marion Sims, who's considered the father of American gynecology, all of his experiments, a good chunk of them were done on enslaved women, again, Black women, African women, right, whose bodies were basically used in the pursuit of science, and in the most brutal way, no anesthetics, all that sort of stuff. But without that, you would have none of sort of the way that we think about gynecology today. Henrietta Lacks, that cell line is responsible for so much of what we understand in terms of genetic inquiry. That's another enslaved African woman. So to say that the idea is our sort of scientific capital or cultural capital, whatever, has been involved in the development of science within this context for so long. It's just not narrated in a way that gives credit to where all that stuff comes from. So who is the scientist? Who's the practitioner? I think it's a question that we legitimately have to ask.
Brilliant. Rebecca?
Wow.
I know, it's like mic drop.
Yeah, very, I think that those are very uncomfortable discussions and things that we should start talking about. And I think GESDA is perfect for this type of uncomfortable conversation, where science can't be, put in a silo. And, the definition of science cannot be, the Einstein, right? Because that really limits who can be a scientist. And I'm really proud, for instance, Afrolabs, we have lots of women that are involved. And so we're trying to change by the face of what a top technologist looks like.
Right.
And so that young people can get used to seeing people that look like them, that are at the top of the game. So I think it's even though sometimes it's very symbolic because it doesn't really make any difference on the ground as far as operations, but the narrative and promoting successful Blacks or colored people or non-traditional Silicon Valley looking people is incredibly important for the way young people perceive themselves. So I think, yeah, we do have to have those uncomfortable discussions and really, I think GESDA is a great place for that.
Great. Mami, any final word on that?
No, it's really looking at GESDA from a different entry point, isn't it?
Yeah.
And really makes us think that this discussion that we're having in front of Lake Vermont has a lot of potential. And as you said, I think the beauty about GESDA is bringing science and diplomacy together, and of course culture into it. So yeah.
Wonderful. Well, we'll open it up for questions and comments and reactions. Great. We'll start right at the front here with Jeff Mulgan, who's a professor of collective intelligence, public policy, and social innovation at UCL, and used to be CEO of Nesta Disaster, is it? My notes had Nesta Disaster. So.
Works. This is a disaster, this microphone.
No,
It
we
works,
hear
it
you.
works.
We hear you.
You can hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, this has been a really interesting conversation. There's probably two things I might throw in, both of which are perhaps a bit uncomfortable, at least for somebody. So the first is the sort of strategic question, which I think lies behind this conversation, is really where does the world put its brain power? Is it on the things that matter or the things which don't matter? And I'm part of a group in the final stages of a project for the UN on steering research and innovation for the global goals, which is collecting huge amounts of data to answer that question. And not surprisingly, the punchline is they're not very well aligned at all. We will show this for each country. So for Cameroon, you'll be able to see what are the SDG priorities, where's the R&D going, are they aligned or not? Now, a lot of the answers in this are probably obvious, huge imbalances of geography in terms of where serious research is done. Although we become more multipolar with China, Korea, and so on, those imbalances are probably as big as 50 years ago, if not bigger. But also, I think more problematic, huge imbalances within fields. So you take food, what kinds of food technology get huge investment will be very particular pathways, not others. AI, massive investment from the military on click-through advertising, tiny little projects on AI for good still. Again, huge imbalances of priorities. So I hope, anyway, there'll be a whole load of material useful for the world on the present. I hope GESDA might take up a role on this because we have no institution which gathers the facts of where now R&D science and technology is directed or misdirected. But there are other aspects of this which really pick up in this conversation. So the only thing I disagreed with is when you said all of science and innovation is speeding up. That's not true. There are important fields where it's slowing down. Although we've had an amazing year for vaccines, whatever you think of COVID, pharmaceutical productivity has been declining for 50 years. The speed of new drugs per dollar inputted is a straight downward line. In other parts of science, that's true as well. Now, that's hard to talk about in London or Geneva or Oxford or MIT and so on. But it's links to all that you were saying about innovations in innovation, because they're nearly always happening elsewhere, in India, in Africa, in Shenzhen, in China, completely different models, closer to the sort of tinkering, the early industrial revolution, are happening, which are probably much more productive in terms of getting value for money than the classic, hugely expensive stuff in a place like mine, UCL or Oxford and so on. But we don't like talking about that because it's uncomfortable for the science community, hates talking about declining productivity in itself. And then the other side of this is trying to get away from the tech determinist view that these sort of technologies rain down on a grateful world. The key thing from our research is showing was every country has choices on pathways. It's not individual technologies. For energy or transport or food, the fourth industrial revolution, they're linked. Once you've made a certain set of choices about your systems, you don't have other choices. And so it's really important to drill down a layer or two to think what is the choice for Cameroon or Paraguay, rather than thinking of every technology separately. And this is very underdone globally. Very few people do that work. So there tends to be therefore a drive just to copy the dominant models from the West or now from China. And just very finally, I mean, COVID, whatever you think, in some ways it's extraordinary. I think this year, 8% of all research globally will be on COVID. Last year, 285,000 research papers. The world can, if it wants, shift its extraordinary science system towards a crisis. But if you stand back, there's a massive misdirection of brain power relative to the things we've collectively said we want with the SDGs. And the chief data scientist of Facebook, I think he put it best when he said what a tragedy it was the best minds of his generation worked on click-through advertising.
But to challenge your challenge on us for a little bit and I noted hands back there. When you talked about science and innovation slowing down, isn't that in the metrics of what is established? This is what we're talking about, the informal, the indigenous that has not been fitted neatly into these structures that are measured.
Exactly. So it's the highest.
So it's moving.
Highest funded systems have got very sharply declining productivity, but the ones on the edges are often doing things much more efficiently.
Yeah. So what do we make of that? Is it that it's actually declining, or we're just in the wrong space and paying attention to the wrong places? Thanks for that, Joe. We'll move right to the back there. I see some very enthusiastic hands.
Thank you. It's a great panel, Ricardo Chavarriaga from the CLARE Network on Human-Centered AI. And it was very interesting to see this uncomfortable conversation about how do we see science and how what we understand science lives outside many people and many views. So how can we move on from this uncomfortable conversation to some action, and we avoid that GESDA falls into the same trap of representing on the science side only those visions on those so-called experts? And I mean, it's not by chance that we are holding this in Campus Biotech. I work here for 15 years, and it's part of this view that we have of what research science centers looks like. So what can be done to ensure that the science part on this instrument or this initiative really reflects all the modalities and flavors that science really has?
Absolutely. I think there was a hand right next to you, else there's also another hand back at the front.
Hi, should I stand up? Can you see me?
We are trying to, if you could stand up, it would be great.
No worries. Hi, thank you so much. The panel is super interesting. I am a student of political science and international relations, so I'm coming from more of a diplomacy side of things. And one thing I found very interesting was this whole debate about institutionalism, where funding is going through these big universities, through official channels, maybe through supranational bodies. On the other hand, you have the more local level sort of innovation that's happening in most developing countries. So my question is, what is the right balance here? And looking at it from the angle of, say, a development agency that wants to provide for scientific research funding through a variety of channels. So how do they go about, say, providing the sort of institutional, the easy way, which is just giving money to university for research projects, but also sort of facilitating the local level innovators in say, working in their house or tinkering with small things? What is the balance here, according to you?
Interesting question. There was another hand here, and then we'll come back to the panel for a reaction.
Hello, I'm Marcus Allemann from SwissAid, which is an NGO operating 9 countries, among them 4 in Africa. So development work, and I'm resonating very, very much with what has been said here. And I just want to echo on the question on what could be the recommendation to GESDA. I think there's one that is quite clear to me. I'm really impressed of the radar as a new instrument to be followed up. But when I look at it, I think it's quite biased as well. It's 350 contributions from the north. It's only 22 from Africa, 11 from South America. And I think the second edition should be balanced better. Because I think all that has been said, and it's also our experience, resonates that we need to listen more. And when it comes, for example, to climate adaptation, I think the female farmer out in the field has some other solutions ready or some other ideas that science should go into than we do have them in the north. So
Absolutely.
I think solution is also created from the people out in the field in the south.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And as I just hand the final word to the panelists to note even how the tools we use to listen, many of us come from more oral cultures. So if we have, and it's a big question for the radar, for example, how do you facilitate a conversation with the person who's at the front line of navigating this climate adaptation and has found ways that we should probably be listening on, but it's not going to sit in front of a computer or even their mobile phone and write it out, right? The tools we use to listen will determine the kinds of information we actually gather. And that's a really good insight to keep in mind for GESDA. But let me come back to the panel real quick. There's a question about balance. I don't know if anybody has, yeah, okay, Rebecca.
Yeah, I'll take the second question about how, I guess, development agencies can work directly with grassroots organizations. And I actually have a practical example of where this is being done successfully so far. I talked about the organization called Afrolabs, which is a grassroots organization. These are hubs created by local people, mostly entrepreneurs. And there's another organization called ABAN, which is the African Business Angels Network. And the intent of this organization is to support early stage investment into African startups. So increase capacity for possible potential investors, local investors, African investors, to invest in African startups so that the money can start coming from Africa to Africa. And so that afterwards, the wealth stays within the community. So ABAN and Afrolabs signed an agreement and started a program called Catalytic Africa. And Catalytic Africa is a matching program. So if a startup that's in a hub, that's in an Afrolabs, in the Afrolabs network, gets angel investment from an angel investor that's in an ABAN network, then we, which is the joint program called Catalytic Africa, will match that investment, right? So we up to 60,000 euro, right? So we will double or triple the amount of money that the angel investors put into the startup. We thought of that. In other words, it wasn't a development agency. We determined that this is what would best support our ecosystem. And so there's a small percentage that goes to the hub to keep monitoring and supporting the startup. There's a tiny percentage that goes to the angel network because we want to encourage the structuring of these angel networks across the continent because it helps build and catalyze investment. And so then we went shopping for who was going to put the money into the pool of the funds that we could then match. And we were able to convince AFD, which is the French development agency, and they put in €1.5 million. And I thought, I was like, that was, and they were so scared to do this, by the way, because this is so unusual for them. First of all, we're not government organizations, we're like these startup, and I mean, they were just, so it was a real challenge to get through the paperwork, to get the contracts done and things like that. But I'm grateful for the opportunity that agency gave us. He's like, okay, we have never structured anything like this. We don't even know what this looks like. But if you say that this is what you need, we're going to take a chance, right? And so we're going to put in this amount of money this year. If it works, maybe we'll look at it again. And obviously that's one pool. we're looking for other development partners that will accompany the project so that we can do more of this, more of the matching. And so, yeah, that's one example of civil society. And what we find is that very often, you know, these international aid organizations, international development organizations, don't want to look at the projects that were developed by the grassroots. So sometimes they'll fund the grassroots, but they'll fund them based on a bid or call for proposal for a grant that's very structured already.
Right.
And says, okay, this is what we want, and then who's the best person to do it, even though, and we'll go for the money, right? We'll apply and try to get the money, but we know that the impact won't be anything, you know, what is really needed on the ground. And so allowing the grassroots organization to design their own programs and trust them,
Yeah.
to deliver on those programs, and let them even screw up from time to time. Right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, it's, and I'm not talking about money disappearing or anything like that, but maybe part of the program doesn't work and we may have to change things. We didn't make promises. We're hoping that this will support, you know, but we don't know. We don't know what the outcome is yet. And we haven't promised anything. And so allow them to tinker.
Yeah.
You know, so that's my,
Absolutely. I know we're about to be kicked out, but yeah, quick final word.
I'm just gonna say, I'd say like let the money disappear. Like let it disappear sometimes. That's like you just let it go, because if you're too constrained, like that, you're never gonna find anything. That's the first thing. I think the other question that was tackled is how can you what was it? How can you foster? I just wrote it down. How can we be more inclusive systems of thought, right? I think, you know, here it's one comment is like, are we the only ones who look like us on this panel? And like, how do you dot panels so that you've got point, counterpoint, these perspectives brought into other situations? The first. Second, there are a whole range of thinkers who are actually writing on sort of like different understandings and definitions of science and inclusivity in that. From a research perspective, so folks like, I think Zimbabwean Clapperton Mavunga, you know, like sort of like the like history of science and sort of the knowledge of science or the process of scientific inquiry. There are like Anthony Appia thinking about it as well. There's a whole range of scholars who are thinking about it from that sense. And those are folks that are really important in terms of the way that we consider science. And then lastly, and then I'll shut up, is just on the, sorry, I wrote the, yeah, I mean, like, it really is to just go back to the, like, you just have to, like, the money has to flow and you just have to kind of not worry about it. That's my thought process.
Wonderful. I don't know if we're completely out of time, I believe. And a final word, we'll huddle outside and have it. But please join me in thanking this distinguished panel for sharing their time and their insights. Lots of feedback for GESDA. So we'll put you on the spotlight and we'll be back in a year to keep you in check. Thank you so much for joining us.
and can somebody please tell AFD that I said nice things about them?